My name is Lyle Skanes, and I'm a practice-based researcher in creative writing and digital media. Most of my research involves designing a creative experiment in order to explore questions about the act of creativity. In my case, creative writing. How the creative practitioner's cognition changes during creative activities, and the effects of any experimentation upon the creative artifact itself. In this presentation, I'll be reviewing the methodological approach that I use in my own research and that I teach to my research students. I'll go over the critical and methodological approaches I use and describe a practice-based research project that I conducted as an example of this approach. While my research is primarily in creative writing, I supervise research projects across numerous creative disciplines, and so this model can be adapted for many different kinds of creative practice, including filmmaking, game design, fine arts, translation, drama and theater, media production, journalism, and many more. I'm going to move through some definitions of the different types of practice-related research that are conducted, and then focus more on the methods and concepts I apply specifically to practice-based research: ethnomethodology, cognitive models for creativity, and analytical approaches to the creative artifacts. Once these foundations are established, I'll overview my practice-based research method, including discussion of a sample project. Depending on the research objectives, the subject area, and the researcher themselves, there are many approaches to conducting research through creative practice. I find it's helpful at this stage to differentiate between the broad categories of practice-related research before moving on specifically to discuss practice-based research in more detail. Practice as research applies to projects that are entirely creative. The creative artifact represents the research itself, with no critical component included. This approach is commonly used in many creative areas. For example, a music composer may present a score as their creative output, a game designer the final game, a creative writer a short story or novel. Practice and research involves parallel creative and critical research activities, wherein the two activities inform one another, but may not necessarily have direct links. This is a model that has been traditionally used in arts research in university settings. A poet may produce a book of their own poems for their creative outputs, and then offer critical analysis or discourse of other poets' work in the form of monographs or journal articles without reference to their own creativity. Obviously, the researcher's creative work here will give them perspective and insight into their critical work, but is not directly tied into it. Practice-led research focuses on projects that involve the creative practice, which leads to new knowledge, but which may not be necessary to understand the critical discussion. For instance, one of my master's students was interested in how performing a character with a mental illness could help the actor and audience to increase their awareness of that mental illness and empathy for those suffering from it. Her project required her to design a creative performance in order to explore the question, but the performance itself was not part of the final thesis. Practice-based research is applied when the creative act is an original act, often a creative experiment, seeking to create new knowledge about the practice and its outcomes. The distinction here between practice-led research and practice-based research is that the latter is usually to explore questions about the creative act itself. How does the process work? How does creativity work? How does a specific experimentation affect the creator's process? And how does it affect the final artifact? It can often be difficult to distinguish between practice-led and practice-based research. Keep in mind that practice-based research usually lends itself in some way towards questions about creativity, creative acts, and how creative experimentation affects the creative work. This is what I'll be focusing on throughout the rest of this presentation. The key element of practice-based research is autoethnomethodology, or self-observation. Ethnomethodology is a social science approach to research described by Harold Garfinkel, and is essentially any methodology that observes people at work at everyday activities for the purpose of analyzing these activities and behaviors in order to get at the fundamental behaviors, thought processes, and cognition underlying those activities. Not all practice-based research is necessarily focused on the creative activity. Some projects are more interested in the creative work that results from an experiment, but for those that are, ethnomethodology provides a framework for self-observation that is an already established and accepted approach to research. Garfinkel recommends a documentary method of observation, developing a system for recording observations of the activities as they occur. In the arts, a lot of practitioners rely mainly on retrospective reflection about their process. At the end of the creative act, they look back on how they created it and why they made the decisions that led to the final work. Unfortunately, this is an incredibly problematic method of observation, as individuals either do not have enough distance from their own activities to recognize patterns and sequences of significance, or they're so distanced from the actual activity that their memories cannot be considered accurate. Instead, I recommend developing a system that allows the practice-based researcher to document their practice in situ, as the creative activity occurs. The biggest, and perhaps most difficult to get used to for some, element is keeping a research log. Notes on activities related to the project, what else is going on that might influence the project, which includes what other creative work is being read, played, watched, listened to, etc., project progress, noting stumbling blocks and new ideas and charting their solutions and development, and more. I usually make these notes directly after a writing session, sometimes even during it. As a creative writer, writing in a journal about the creative project is almost as common as writing itself. For other practitioners, this might be less natural, but definitely just as useful. I also recommend developing a habit of recording notes directly in the creative project itself. I use a particular notation in my text files to write out thoughts and comments in the creative draft as it's being created. Questions that occur, ideas about where the story might go, frustrations about where it has gone, etc. In software or game development, the comments function of any programming language can be very useful here. I also record any edits made during the revision process, whether that's general notes about how I want to reshape the piece, or inline tracked changes for proofreading edits, and I'll save the different draft versions. Obviously, I've developed a system that works for me. Each researcher should come up with a system that works for them. What's important about the system is that the researcher should be able to look back through this documentation and analyze it once the creative project has been completed. You should be able to map the research log to the creative activity taking place at the same time. This enables you to recognize patterns and correlations in the work, to use the research notes as evidence for analysis of the creative activity. I should note here that it's vitally important that any practice-based research project begin with a clearly defined research question. I'll dig into this deeper later on, but the research question is what will direct the entire project, from the creative activity to the background research to the analysis applied. It will help you develop a methodology appropriate to the project and give a firm direction to the discussion that results. As I mentioned previously, not all practice-based projects are necessarily concerned with digging into the cognitive activities involved in creativity. In which case, what you should take away from this section is that whatever your project is concerned with, you should make sure to use an appropriate model for discussing it. In my research, I'm very much interested in the creative process, how we come up with ideas, how we cope with changes to our normal practice, and how the internal process of creativity is affected by external elements. In order to contextualize and make sense of these questions, I use the foundation of Linda Flowers and John Hayes' 1981 cognitive process model of writing. This is a model describing the cognitive space of writing as it occurs. You can see here that it begins from the intersection of the writer's long-term memory, what we know about our topic, and the rhetorical problem, or the text that we want to write. The writing process involves idea generation, including planning the project, organizing resources, and setting goals. Is it a novel that needs character development and plotting? A game that needs software development with a firm deadline for delivery? A lot of elements come into play here, depending on the rhetorical situation. Flower and Hayes term the actual act of writing translation, which makes sense when you pair it with their 1984 multiple representation thesis. This posits that when we imagine a creative text, regardless of the final form we've planned for it, whether that be prose, game, or film, we imagine it in all the communication modes at our disposal as humans. This means we don't actually think in written text. We think in images, sounds, and feelings. When we write, we have to translate these cognitive imaginings into written text. Finally, we have a text that we've produced and we need to review and revise it. All throughout the process of idea generation, translating, and reviewing, we are monitoring the text produced so far, evaluating whether it is meeting our rhetorical goals, and generating new ideas for how it can better meet those goals. While it seems these steps are differentiated from one another, that's just a side effect of making this into an easily communicated image. In reality, many of these cognitive processes are going on at the same time, bleeding into one another. In exploring Flower and Hayes' cognitive process model, I found that the area of idea generation was somewhat underdeveloped. After all, the one question creative writers probably get asked the most is, where do your ideas come from? If creative practice research is actually going to attempt to answer this question, we need to be able to dig deeper. Ward, Fink, and Smith outlined their Geniplore model, describing idea generation as a cyclical model. We generate what they call pre-inventive structures or hints of ideas, whether that be for characters, story world, the shape of a sculpture, a melody, etc. We explore these baby ideas, digging into them, seeing where they can go. We hold them up against the product constraints, or rather what Flower and Hayes term the rhetorical problem, determining how well they fit the creative project we're developing. We then focus or expand the concepts, generating more detailed ideas and pre-inventive structures, exploring them further, evaluating them for how well they work for our project, and so on and so forth. The parallels here to Flower and Hayes' cognitive processes model and its cyclical structure are clear. The Geniplore model fits well, because of this, within the planning process they describe. A key difference between practice-based research and many other research projects in both the humanities and the sciences is that these projects are primarily exploratory. When we start the project, we don't always know what's going to happen, where the creative practice will take us, or what the final artifact and critical findings will be. This can make planning the project and writing those research proposals for graduate school or funding applications a difficult task, as many research methods module leaders, graduate schools, and funders want to see a list of predicted outcomes of the project. What is key is to keep your research question in mind. Keep making observations and recordings in your research logs, and to take a broad approach to these records and observations rather than only noting down what seems like it might be relevant at the time. You never know when a crucial insight is going to come. You never know when weeks or months of frustration in the creative project is going to provide a breakthrough. What you do need is the ability to recognize these insights when they occur, even if it's after the fact while reviewing your observation notes. Macri and Blandford's theory of serendipity describes how crucial these moments are to recognizing important new knowledge as it is developed. It's not just luck that leads to important critical insights. Rather, it's the convergence of your knowledge and experience, gained through background research and your expertise in your area, which help you to recognize that this knowledge is important to your research area, and the skills necessary to apply that insight to your artifact and your critical exegesis. The example that I'll be discussing later on in the presentation was selected primarily because it's a clear case of serendipity, leading to significant outcomes in both the creative project and the research project. Lastly, I embed all of this within Csikszentmihalyi's systems model of creativity, which is important to the context of serendipity in that it helps to situate the researcher within their research area. This model defines domain as the research area. In my case, this is creative writing. Other practitioner domains are game design, filmmaking, music, media production, journalism, translation, fine arts, and more. And while the term field is often applied to refer to the subject area, in this model it refers to the people within your domain. the gatekeepers who will either accept or reject the insights you develop from your work. In academia, the field is other researchers, peers who may be reviewing or editing your work, or examiners who may pass or fail your work. In creative domains, the field is composed of gatekeepers who evaluate and publish or disseminate your work: editors, producers, studios, galleries, critics, etc. Finally, this model incorporates the person who is creating the work or researching a topic. For my work, I combined all these elements into a practitioner model of creative cognition. You can see it's based on Flower and Hayes' cognitive process model, but incorporates the Genipour model in the planning stages, multiple representation thesis in the translation phase, and intrusions of the actual, which incorporates both serendipity and external disruptions to the work. All of this is embedded within Csikszentmihalyi's systems model of creativity, as the domain can shape the practitioner researcher's long-term memory, and the field can shape the rhetorical problem. Again, as I noted before, not all practice-based research is concerned with the cognitive basis of creativity. For those that are, however, this model is highly adaptable and applicable to many different kinds of projects, whether they be creative writing or not, and it's firmly based in established research. Whatever model you develop for your own project, make sure it's based in established research, but also allows you to discuss your findings in the appropriate context. Now, I'm not going to tell anyone how to conduct their creative work. Everyone is different, every project is different, and all the different approaches to creative activities are outside the scope of this discussion. It's often helpful, however, to write down how you work, what your typical creative process is, so that you can use it as a base to determine whether your practice-based research is affecting it. As mentioned previously, not all practice-based projects ask questions about the cognitive activities of the creative act. Likewise, not all practice-based projects may be concerned with effects on the final artifact. Again, I'm offering some methodological tools to keep in a metaphorical research toolkit. It's up to the practitioner researcher to decide which tools to use for which project. In my own research, I think of the creative work as yet another element of documentation. It is yet more data that can be analyzed for critical insight. All the elements of documentation that have been created over the course of the project, the creative work, the research logs, revision notes, and inline commentary, all of this is data that must be analyzed. Depending on the project and the particular documentation being evaluated, there are a number of different methods of analysis that can be applied. As a creative writer working in digital media, I will apply literary and media analysis techniques to my creative work, from narratology to semiotics. If the research question is focused in literary aspects, I'm going to use literary theory. If it focuses on discourse, then discourse analysis might be more appropriate. The important takeaway here is that each practitioner researcher should be aware of the appropriate analytical approaches for works in their domain. You may also need to be aware of appropriate analytical approaches outside your domain, such as social science methods, linguistic analysis, discourse analysis, and more. Practice-based research is not a one-method-fits-all approach. Each project will require a specific methodology that applies the most appropriate methods from various domains in order to answer the research question in the best and most robust way possible. Now we put all of this into action. This is the practical step-by-step overview of my approach to practice-based research. For each phase here, I have linked it up with the elements of the practitioner model of creative research, as the two work in tandem. The first step is to establish the research problem, the rhetorical situation your project will address. This is the time for idea generation, brainstorming, and goal setting. In my example, I was interested in how moving from my established prose writing practice to digital writing affected me, my process, and the creative works that resulted. To answer the question, I set a creative experiment, to write a story in both prose and digital forms. The prose novella was written because when I started, I had no experience in digital writing whatsoever. I couldn't program, couldn't code, hadn't worked with animation or building websites much beyond HTML tags like background and font color. I wanted to be able to compare the two practices to one another. In this section, I wanted a particular chapter of my story to be in hyperfiction in the digital version, a website constructed using HTML and JavaScript. The next step is to conduct background research. This step may already be accomplished in practitioner researchers who are already experts in their domains. Similarly, students conducting practice-based research may have established background research through their studies. Nonetheless, it's good to make sure your knowledge of your domain is thorough, not only so that you know whether or not your project is actually relevant and novel, but also so that when serendipitous insights arise, you're able to recognize and apply them. The background research on this element was similar to that of my entire project: creative writing, literary studies, electronic literature, media studies, and creativity. As I mentioned, my long-term memory was that of a prose writer. In my research, I was going to have to learn HTML and JavaScript. As part of my background research, I also began the planning stages, including idea generation and exploration for the creative work. It was a chapter of the larger novella, engaging in the same themes. I had to learn HTML and JavaScript. As part of this process, I also reviewed other digital stories that used these technologies. At the same time, I deepened my critical understanding of my domain, paying particular attention to prominent theories and discourse in electronic literature, digital writing, and practice-based research. Given the new state of the practitioner researcher's long-term memory after conducting the background research, it's generally good to revisit the research question. You might learn something new in the course of your research that redirects or reshapes your project or leads to refinement of the research question. In this case, the research question was still applicable and remained unchanged. As a result of my creative planning, I had developed further goals for the creative work, however. To create a digital story that consisted of a clickable fantasy map, which the reader could explore in any order to get bits of the story as they move through it. As the research gets underway in earnest, it's important to continue the contextual research process, developing knowledge in the chosen research area, adjusting the project to new ideas and revisions, and being open to the insights that arise from the convergence of all these activities. The primary research phase is to conduct empirical research, that is, to undertake the creative project. This engages all aspects of the practitioner model of creative research. For this chapter, I was writing the chapter in both prose and in a web version in HTML and JavaScript. In planning, I not only had to think about the prose text, but also the hyperfiction, its imagery, structure, navigation, and audio. I had to translate these ideas into text, actually building the hyperfiction as a website. The element of serendipity in this piece occurred in the planning stages as I was seeking resources to use in the hyperfiction. Now, I'm a decent writer, but I'm not an artist by any stretch of the imagination. So for this clickable fantasy map I'd envisioned as a pre-inventive structure, I was bumbling around on deviantart.com for resources, Photoshop brush packs that could be used as tools to build my own map like the one shown here. DeviantArt at the time, and as far as I know this is still the case, does not have a Creative Commons search. So the search results that you get show works that you can use under Creative Commons licensing, as well as completely copyrighted works. And here is where an external influence came into the work. I found this image, which was very different from what I'd planned, but that I really loved. The colors were better, the perspective was inviting. It makes you want to enter this landscape and explore. This was what I wanted to use, but I couldn't. It was all rights reserved. So instead, I used it as inspiration. You can see here where elements of the image left a big mark on my work. The shape of the island, the perspective, and the addition of color. Obviously, my image is a much poorer one artistically, but it's one that worked well for the story, as it gives the reader-player plenty of options for clicking and exploring different areas of the story. I did a lot of thinking about how this affected my work. My initial thoughts went into some research notes, and I used these to post on my research blog about the process. You can see at the end of the post where I frame the idea of implicit collaboration, the notion that these found media elements shared in online spaces actually have an element of authorship in the new work, even though the original author has no idea about it. The insight, brought about through the influence of serendipity, caused me to revisit my research problem. The question for the overall research project remained the same, but a new sub-research question had emerged, which led to an individual chapter in the work. How does artistic appropriation affect narrative composition? Drawing from this, do the effects vary according to the material being appropriated? And what implications does this have for authorship? These new questions meant that I had to conduct even more contextual research. I looked at other creative works or discourse on those works that involved some aspect of non-traditional collaboration. I reviewed works on hitrecord.org, an artistic community that essentially crowdsources creative talent for film, music, and publishing projects. And I looked at current examples of what some theorists term uncreative writing, or remixes, where authors sample and remix others' texts much in the same way that pop artists sample other pop artists' songs. I reviewed Andy Campbell's Changed and had the opportunity to discuss its creation with him, as he uses images from Creative Commons as well. And fan fiction was a clear example of implicit collaboration, so this area offered plenty of material as well as critical discourse about artistic contribution and authorship. And finally, I looked back at my own previous work on the project, as this certainly wasn't the first time I'd borrowed from the Commons, whether it was images, sound, or source code. I'll reiterate here the importance of keeping in situ observation notes and having a strong research management system all the way through the creative process. I had no idea that fairly late into this project, I'd have this insight about media borrowing, appropriation, and implicit collaboration. I certainly couldn't have foreseen the need to take notes specifically about these aspects as I was working. But because I took a broad approach to the notes I made, I was able to go back and analyze aspects of this kind of borrowing in the other chapters of the creative work that I'd already finished. I also needed to expand my theoretical understanding in this area. This called for further research into different domains. I researched all that I could on appropriation, both within digital writing and art in general. I returned to my practitioner model, using it to map the internal processes involved in seeking, discovering, and using others' work in my own, embedding this form of collaboration within the overall model I'd been using throughout the project. I also did research into the ethics, economy, and discourse on collaborative practices in digital spaces. This gave me a groundwork for discussion of questions about authorship and original contribution in this type of work. Now that I had discovered a key insight thanks to my creative activities and formulated a specific research question related to those activities, which directed further research, I could formulate a clear answer to that research question. My argument answered my stated research question: how does artistic appropriation affect narrative composition? In digital environments, working in these multiple modes leads to what I've termed implicit collaboration, wherein the appropriated work has some role in the authorship of the new work. Given that digital resources are so easily shared and duplicated, this has ethical implications in terms of ownership and authorship. Once I had a clear argument, and I had conducted the necessary research and analysis to make that argument, I could put it into a critical exegesis. In this example, this exegesis was a chapter in my thesis and later a journal article. From here, the article outline is fairly straightforward. An introduction that clearly states the argument, offers background and context for the work, and makes the importance of the research clear. A methodology section in humanities work, especially literary studies, is often overlooked because the methods can be very standardized to post-textual analysis. In practice-based work, however, I've found we need to be very explicit about the research approach and methods used. Examiners and researchers are often unfamiliar with practice-based research, as it's still an emerging method. So it's vital that they're left with no questions whatsoever about the validity of the research methods employed. I've had reviewers, on this paper no less, give glowing remarks about the findings and theory of the paper, but then say the research should be done with post-textual analysis on someone else's work. Obviously, the insights reached from this project would never have occurred through post-textual analysis. It was just the reviewer's unfamiliarity with practice-based research and my failure to explain the method thoroughly in that draft of the paper that led to comments like these. Learn from my mistakes and make your approach and methodology clear. The rest of the paper can be organized as appropriate for your project. Sometimes a separate analysis and discussion/conclusion section is the best approach, and other times a combined analysis/discussion makes more sense. Either way, it's important that the conclusions are drawn from analysis of the process, the creative artifact, contextual works, and relevant critical discourse and theory. This is how you justify and demonstrate your contribution to your research domain. And that's it, the approach I take to practice-based research with an example project. Remember, the research question is essential. It will direct the research, the method, the critical resources used, and the formulation of the final argument and exegesis. Write it down and keep revisiting it at various stages in the research. If new insights come to you, write them down. You have the choice to refocus your research around a new insight or to save it for a later day, chapter, or paper. This presentation is publicly available at tinyurl.com/PBR Method 2016, and further resources are available on the Creative Practice Research site, including links to useful research tools for managing your research and keeping your observation logs, and a full critical references list for discourse on practice-based research. You can also tweet me at lsgaines, and I'm happy to chat about practice-based research anytime.